So it's really, this talk is really about our work to extend Lean for knowledge work. Now, the thing about the 21st century was that there are two big changes or challenges or opportunities for Lean. So one is, of course, the internet. So the internet has enabled new kinds of business models, new kinds of organizational structures. We now see the world moving at ever more rapid pace, and we see hyper growth, and we see an emphasis on communities. And it's a lot easier now to put together communities, whether for a nonprofit purpose or a for-profit purpose, or even community-based business models. Think of Twilio. If you're doing a startup and you need a function to send an SMS to someone, you use Twilio's API, and Twilio set up a venture fund to invest in startups using their infrastructure. That's a community-based business model. The other big thing that's happened is that we're now starting to understand more about how the human brain works. And unfortunately, sort of classical Lean, in terms of its methodology, hasn't really changed that much since about 1985. So we figured it's time for an update. So almost 10 years ago, I started what was then the Lean Software Institute to bring Lean to the software industry. And that was later expanded to knowledge work in general. And when I looked at all of these challenges, I thought, well, maybe my talk should have been called Lean versus the 21st century, because it is a very different world now than when Lean first started. When we look at what we're trying to achieve, we talked about what's the destination, where we're trying to get to, what does Lean look like in a company. There are really three things that we talk about as being Lean, or being part of Lean. So one is the aspect of Lean that's about organizational design. So there's a bunch of practices for that, setting up value streams. And there's some practices also that have to do with product design. Then there's, of course, the aspect of Lean that's nonstop learning. So that's Kaizen, we all know about that. And then there is a culture that enables that. So how do we achieve that in the 21st century with all these changes going on? I'm going to talk a little about the Lean Systems Framework, which is our approach to this, and I'm hoping that you can borrow some ideas from that, and that will help influence our conversation a little bit. So when we started trying to do this for software, and we were asking questions about what were the sources of flow impediments, very quickly we found out that the artifacts that were flowing through the value streams were a source of concern and a source of a fair amount of pain. And so we had the classic garbage in, garbage out phenomenon. And so we realized that we really had to start looking at information architecture in addition to value stream architecture. And when we looked at the kind of artifacts that people are producing and consuming, we could sort of put them into three categories. Some had to do with goals and constraints, so we call those prescriptive artifacts. Some had to do with solutions to problems that you were generating, so artifacts that you were creating, and we call those descriptive. Source code, design solutions, design specs. And some were used to make decisions, trade-off curves, rule sets, and so forth, and we call those evaluative. And we realized that the structure of these artifacts was something that we should pay some attention to, and so over time we developed a very simple type system for describing those structures. And we realized that we had to separate between the visual presentation and the structure of the content. Now, furthermore, we know that knowledge workers spend something like 1/3 of their time looking for information. It's pretty funny because I actually spent a few minutes looking for that number. Sort of recursive irony there. And so very early on, we realized that we have to really look at repositories and where these artifacts are being kept. And it's not unusual for us when we start working with organizations to find that they have multiple redundant repositories. So I remember a mid-sized organization we worked with a year and a half ago, publicly traded company, so what we call mature lifecycle stage. They had something like, in their digital media division, 18 redundant repositories for requirements and other software-related artifacts. So that's not unusual at all. So it's a mess. It's like the information architecture version of that garage. You never take the time to clean up. Now, another thing that we discovered, going back to value stream performance again, is that whenever we had a cube building up, if there was an internal boundary, there was there was not just correlation, there was often causation. And so we started looking at organization structure and flow. We realized that, hey, organization architecture is pretty important. Let's take a look at different aspects of that and how that impacts flow. Now, you might think of organization architecture as just, the classical org chart, and we do map that. But early on, we also realized we have to look at who the major influencers were in the organization. And that could easily be an individual contributor. In fact, for one of our clients, the biggest shareholder is a guy that refuses to be anything but a programmer. He owns 85% of the stock in that company. And things got a lot easier once I realized that. Now, if you map your organization, if you map out you change your org chart to account for who the major influences are, the shape is a bit different. And this is very helpful when you're trying to achieve organizational change, because these are often the conduits through which new ideas travel. They have the ability to excite people. They may just refuse to be formal leaders in the organization, but they are leaders in a different way. So there's lots of possible organization architectures. And one of the things that we've learned by developing this framework is that the possible design space in organizational design, in all the 5 dimensions that I talked to you about, is much bigger than most people ever consider. So for example, here is sort of there's a book called The Connected Company. Dave Gray is a co-author. So they use the term pods. Actually, Al used the term pods too for these teams, the cross-functional teams, and then you have sort of a platform that supports them, and then they can form hierarchies. So Google uses that. If you have a bigger project, just put together a hierarchy of these teams, and your value stream architecture hopefully will kind of mirror that. There are some companies. There's a Danish furniture company that has self-organizing teams, and really no strategic goals for the company at all. People just decide what to work on, and if they think it's interesting, then let's do it. So they have to have there's some platform there, but there's a very thin edge. There's a very thin wall between these teams and the outside world, which is very helpful if you're trying to learn from the outside world, working with customers to build new products. Of course, your people could be somewhere else too. So you have to take that into account when you're mapping organization architectures to geographical location. And that again constrains the physical workspaces. And that's something that we started early on. We started taking photos of workspaces. And so when you think about task design, you think about practices that you all love or passionately disagree about, some of which are collaborative. There is an information architecture aspect of those practices. There is a process or value stream aspect of those practices. And there's an organization architecture aspect of those practices. So if you're going to redesign sequential work that's done in isolation to be collaborative work, you have to think about how those dimensions interact. So if you don't have enough collaborative spaces in your company and you want to do lots of collaborative work, hey, that's a problem. Now, the other thing that we realized early on, and I was actually struggling to figure out where to put this arrow because the answer is your mileage varies depending on where people are. But the more architectural coupling you have, the more pressure there is to increase the batch size. So, and now you can do small batches with a high degree of coupling. It's just that the overhead is so big because 90% of it is retesting a bunch of stuff because you have all these couplings and dependencies. And then there's 5-10% of actually doing value-added stuff. So we think about product design and product architecture design from the perspective of achieving requirements to deliver customer value. And what we often neglect is the value stream architecture implication of the product architecture that we build. And all of these dependency arrows between these dimensions are all two-way, by the way. Now, so we started looking at product architecture, and we realized very quickly, if your product architecture looks like this, your organization architecture looks like that, and your value stream architecture, is flat, now you have a problem. Now, where do you discover that if you're just doing conventional lean or Kanban? You discover it because you have flow impediments in the value stream. But the root cause has nothing to do with process per se. And very often when we start working with organizations, the biggest problem with the processes is A, they don't follow them, and B, they're sort of vague. The reason they're vague is that people can never quite do what the process says. And if you ask why, the the answer is in 2 or 3 out of these other dimensions we talked about so far. So by the way, we're not really giving people a recipe or a well-defined method. This is on a lower level. This is sort of the nutrition level. So we can use this to describe all kinds of methods. In fact, we're starting a project now to do a pattern language based on this. So if you have a practice, then you can describe that in terms of each of these dimensions. What does that mean? So, all right. So instead of just thinking about value stream architecture, you have to take into consideration these 3 other dimensions too. And that looks nice. Except very quickly we realized that even when people sort of logically knew what to do as they were redesigning, say, their product development system, we did a lot of that early on, you will get situations like this. People don't seem to act in a reasonable manner. You know, they don't trust each other, they don't collaborate, they don't share information. And to figure that out, we had to tackle describing and changing organizational cultures. And that's usually in the literature, and if you ask practitioners, it's kind of regarded as a black art. You know, our cultures, are they tribes? And what kind of framework do we use? What we did is we looked at cognitive psychology. So cognitive psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, has a clinically proven, track record of changing behavior by changing people's mindsets. So the question was, and we had used this sort of ad hoc in executive coaching, not because people needed therapy, per se, but because their behaviors were linked to assumptions that they held. So when we defined or designed a model for social architecture, we decided that an organizational culture really consists of 3 things. There is your official ideals, your professed values, then the actual behaviors, and we have a survey instrument to extract this from people in organizations, and their mindset. So you can do workshops with people and you can ask why, usually more than 5 times, and often in circles, to try and come up with sort of a set of ideas, shared assumptions that people hold. And by the way, your social architecture can be different in different parts of the company. It's true that you can have subcultures within the organization. Unfortunately, since my time is so limited, I can't go into much detail on this topic, but one cool thing that we did discover, because we can quantify all of this stuff, is that if your cultural integrity is fairly low inside your organization, and that's one of the things we ask people about, on a scale from 0 to 10, to what degree do you actually live up to your ideals, then the behaviors tend to default to the outside culture, which makes sense, right? So if you have a weak culture, then and you're in Italy, you become a typical Italian company, right? And I won't say what that is because this is going to be on the internet, right? But every one of these national stereotypes basically have truth in, right? So if you want to know why people are typical, say, German company and so on, don't blame German culture. Blame the leaders for not defining their culture better and being more deliberate about what kind of behaviors are we looking to see to support those ideals. Now, in the 20th century, the assumption had been, for decades, that the basic structure of a firm was, departmental silos. And so we invented matrix management to try and bridge that gap. And then if you read the lean literature, people talk about value streams as running across the silos. But because of the new organizational architectures that are possible now, we found immediately that it was much more useful to describe organizations as in a way that didn't link capability of the organization to the structure directly. In other words, you can have an organizational structure that looks at, has a whole bunch of different solutions, and that capability can be implemented in many different ways. Kind of like in systems architectures. There's no reason why all product architectures have to have a layered architecture. We know there are lots of other patterns that people use successfully to implement capabilities. So that's true with organizations too. So we started looking at organizations as just systems of systems. And in fact, and even though I can't go into that today, we can also describe ecosystems around the company as systems on a greater scale. And all these systems are linked together with value streams. And your information architecture basically defines, if you will, the API. It means that the information transfer is typed. So the problem with Kanban is it's untyped. There's a type, it's any type, right? And now I think it's really cool when you see Kanban vendors allowing you to put fields in and enforce. So I hope that continues in that direction. The information architecture is really vital to making knowledge work, or lean work for knowledge work. Now, each of these systems, of course, exhibit all of the 5 dimensions we talked about. Although Social architecture is a little bit of a special case because it's more like a plane that cuts across. So, all right. Now we've also had a fair amount of success with a Kaikaku method that we defined for doing radical redesign of business systems, because typically, A, they're not that well defined, and B, there just is that much low-hanging fruit. So if you get a cross-functional team, high-level folks together, and also middle managers, it all depends on where we can get the knowledge from. 12 to 16 is pretty much the upper limit for that. And you go through the step that almost looks like a simplified A3. But there's a lot of stuff we don't really have to measure, in that much detail. And for new organizations, if you're doing mergers, you can use a variant of this as well. So maybe there isn't an existing organization to define. You're just designing a new organization. And then you're designing in 5 dimensions, basically. And so immediately we see, 60 plus. 60 is the worst we've ever done, lead time reduction for product development systems. And the 95% one was Scrum, actually, before. And that wasn't because Scrum is bad per se. It was just that in that design, the artificially required batch size was very large in relation to what they had to do. So instead of telling people this method or recipe is good, this method or recipe is bad, what we've been trying to do is to say, well, here are the dimensions in which you can understand and design organizations, and now figure out what changes to make and what dimensions to improve performance. So we're basically trying to make our clients into organization designers. Now, classical Kaizen has 2 parts. And this worked really well in the 20th century, at least if you did it right. There's Hansei, which is where you're reflecting and harvesting ideas and observations. You make selections in Hansei meetings as to which problems are important to work on. And people talked about Hoshin before. We've had a fair amount of success with using Hansei to sort of keep an organization-wide context with problem trees and mind maps for what problems do we know about that are worth working on, and so forth. And then the A3 is the problem-solving method. But if you look at an organization's learning needs, there's internally oriented learning, which is often what A3 is used for. You improve how we function internally with hopefully incremental rapid change. And then Kaikaku is internal and disruptive. I mean, this is very classic, right? But what about these 2 other quadrants? Well, what we did is add a few more problem-solving methods. So there's JDI, which we didn't invent. We learned that from our Lockheed customer early on. So they just called it "just do it." They didn't have time for any analysis. We knew the cost. We knew the solution. We had the budget. And this will take 10 minutes to make a phone call. It's a JDI. Then there's QDA, which is question, design, experiment, adapt. And so that's kind of like build, measure, learn. So that's where you have a question and you want to know the answer. Would this pricing model be more popular than that pricing model? Then there's differential diagnostics, which we learn about by watching a lot of House episodes. You watch House MD? Yeah. And it's very powerful when you have a complicated problem. Sorry, or should I say complex? Still not sure. And well, actually, probably complicated in that case. And you have a lot of possible sources of the problem, and you basically order them you organize them in the order of the most critical and the most important and the most urgent to find out first, and then you design a test to eliminate, so it's test or treat until the patient dies, or hopefully you fix the problem. And then for learning about the external world, and you can't necessarily be disruptive, but at least you can sort of nudge the world, is you have to go out and map the world and basically build domain models of the world. So this is sort of the latest thing we're working on now. There's a paper we published in the Cutter Journal in April that has pretty much all of this except for the WM, which is brand new. All right. Now, we know that people's brains are wired differently. And there's been a lot of talk about personality types and all of that. So it's hard to really scientifically validate that. But what we can look at, and what's more interesting to look at, is how people function on the cognitive level. And so we learn about this fantastic framework called the Cognitive Preference Survey, where you figure out, there's a 48-question test you can use to figure out if people are associative thinkers or sequential thinkers. And anyone who's done any teaching know that if you have a bunch of associative people in the room, a very different conversation than if you have a bunch of sequential people in the world who just want everything spoon-fed step by step. So slightly more than half people are are sequentially preferent. And I'm sort of a weird hybrid because I'm both, which is about 1% of the population, no, 2% of the population, I think. But you have to think about what kind of mix of people you have in the room when you're trying to do brainstorming or if you're doing root cause analysis and pursuing that, that's actually fairly linear. If you're trying to do lateral thinking, it's great for associative people. So who knows about de Bono, 6 thinking hats? So that was an early sort of intuitive discovery of all of this. So you basically change people between multiple modes. And then we know that people absorb information differently. So some people are very good at listening. I'm actually a low listener, so I can do one-on-one fairly well, but if I'm 1-on-4, it's actually a big cognitive challenge for me. But I'm a high observer, high reader, as you can probably tell, high talker, which means I often don't know what I know until I hear myself saying it. And I'm a medium mover. So for people who can't sit still in meetings, it's not because they think you're boring, it's just because that's how they process stuff as they're absorbing it, they're moving. If you talk to someone who's a hockey goalie and never moves, that's probably a reason why they make a really good hockey goalie. You just need to move that instant when the puck arrives, right? So we now use this together with these organizational learning practices so that we can basically optimize the process based on who you have in the room. All right, so that's a lean systems framework. So it's got 9+ years of field use in organizations from 20 to 100,000 plus people. Some good quantifiable results, been used in a bunch of different knowledge-based or software-intensive industries, not just for software development, but for other parts of the organization's work as well. Now, when we look at how we've been doing organizational transformation work, it's been kind of traditional. So it's been mostly top-down initiated. And we really we refuse to work with anyone but C-level. And it's been a lot of time. It's really been fairly directed and planned and so on. What we're trying to do is kind of move more in this direction, so it becomes more viral. Because we think lean is really still too hard. So there's a number of practical challenges that people run into. Training is disruptive. The behavior change is difficult. How do you actually support people in becoming coaches instead of traditional middle managers? There's always practical problems with tool support, and how can you track and validate that people actually use what they learn? And so our response to this, and this is a new thing we're soft launching now, is something called leancommunity.com, which is basically a global community of practice with e-learning and some tool support for organizations implementing lean. And because it is an online solution, we can make it available in multiple formats, and you can, because it's e-learning content, you can learn in small pieces and you get homework and implement in small pieces. We actually think that will accelerate implementation and adoption. We're also using gamification. That's a kind of a fun experiment to give people experience points for posting questions in the discussion forum or answering questions and so on. And in addition, I guess I should mention that, the content's going to be based on the lean systems framework. We also have 3 content partners signed up. The logos are kind of small there, but the David Allen Company is one of them. So we've been using GTD with our clients for a number of years. So we're always trying to encourage that. So we're also wanting to address individual productivity. And actually, GTD is the most powerful tool that we found to increase change capacity for leaders, psychological change capacity. They can do a whole talk. And actually, David and I are sort of working on a shared white paper, joint white paper on just that, because that's often a bottleneck. Is the short-term memory and attention capacity is overwhelmed in leaders that we work with. So if you can help them get their heads empty, they have more capacity for embracing new stuff. Anyway, so our vision for this is basically create a mechanism so that we can work together, not just within one company, but across organizations, to also have peer learning across organizations, to build learning organizations together. And hopefully by doing that, we can achieve the ultimate purpose of what we're all trying to do, which is make the world a better place. So thank you very much for your attention.